So now we'll turn our attention to erythrocytes, red blood cells. The erythro is red, cyte refers to a cell. Now they're classically described as biconcave, which is this part here, anucleate, meaning they don't have a nucleus, discs. So as adults, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have many organelles, if any, and they're really just taxis, if you will, for hemoglobin, or train seats for hemoglobin. So if you imagine that the blood vessels are tracks, and then the blood cells, or these red blood cells, would be sort of a train, and in that train is hemoglobin. And that hemoglobin is transported around the body, primarily delivering oxygen, and in a few cases it delivers carbon dioxide as well. They use anaerobic respiration as adults to manufacture their ATP. They have a large surface area for the exchange of oxygen across and carbon dioxide across the cell membrane. And that cell membrane would also contain a considerable number of aquaporins for osmosis of water into and out of the red blood cell. So at this point, you might want to go back and review hyper, hypo, and isotonic solutions and how red blood cells fare, or what happens to them in those different types of solutions. So the job of the red blood cell primarily is to transport oxygen to body cells for use in aerobic respiration. Now that hemoglobin molecule is contained of, or made of, 4 globin chains, 2 alpha chains, 2 beta chains, and this is a quaternary structure, meaning there's multiple protein chains, multiple peptide chains that make up the core of the protein. And deep within those are embedded these heme groups, which are the red discs with the iron, the green core that you see at the center. That's the place that O2, that's diatomic oxygen gas, binds to. Now on the globin chains, we can also bind carbon dioxide, and that's about 20% of the carbon dioxide in blood. 10% of carbon dioxide is dissolved as gas bubbles in the plasma, and the other 70% or so is transported as bicarbonate ions in the plasma, and we discuss that later in the respiratory system. There are approximately 250 million hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell, and each of those hemoglobin molecules can carry 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygen gas molecules. So let's take a look at that in an animation.
All cells need oxygen. It is the essential fuel which is necessary to enable cells to stay alive and to carry out their various activities. Bringing oxygen to the cells requires the uptake of oxygen from the air in the lungs, its transportation in the blood, and its delivery to cells all over the body. The first step is the taking up of oxygen by blood flowing through fine capillaries in the walls of the lungs' air sacs, or alveoli. The oxygen molecules change from their state as a gas freely circulating in the air, dissolving into a solution in the plasma within the capillaries of the alveoli. Once in the solution of the blood, 98% of this dissolved oxygen is taken up by passing red cells, leaving just 2% remaining in the physical solution unattached. Red cells are particularly well suited to transporting oxygen because they contain a special oxygen-binding protein known as hemoglobin. Each molecule of hemoglobin itself contains 4 molecules of heme, an iron-containing pigment, which binds oxygen loosely and reversibly. Hemoglobin that is fully saturated with oxygen is bright red and is called oxyhemoglobin. On the other hand, hemoglobin that is not saturated with oxygen is purplish-blue in color and is called deoxyhemoglobin. It is heme which makes it possible for the red cells to pick up oxygen dissolved in the blood, transport it combined with hemoglobin, and release it back into the blood as oxygen in solution, ready for delivery to the various cells of the body. Hemoglobin gives up its oxygen as red cells travel through capillaries in tissues where there is a low content or partial pressure of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen represents the level of dissolved oxygen in plasma. As oxygen is released and again is carried in solution, the partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries becomes greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in the surrounding tissues. This causes oxygen to move out of the capillaries into the tissues and to finally reach the cells.
And remember that moving out of the red blood cell into the plasma and then into the tissues themselves is performed by diffusion, passive transport from where the partial pressure or concentration is higher in the plasma to where it's lower in the tissues.
This graph, the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin, shows why hemoglobin is particularly suited to its role in transporting oxygen. The oxygen dissociation curve demonstrates the relationship between the oxygen carried in combination with hemoglobin, the O2 saturation, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. The sharp upstroke and the flat plateau illustrate how oxygen is released to the tissues over a wide range of conditions. Its shape means that although the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood returning from the lungs and being pumped out by the arteries may be reduced to only 50% of the normal value, say due to lung disease or high altitude, hemoglobin will still be 85% saturated with oxygen.
Question number 5. Describe how O2 is transported in blood. And question number 6. Describe the 3 ways in which carbon dioxide, CO2, is transported in blood. So now we'll turn our attention to erythropoiesis, the process by which red blood cells are made, and the how, the why, the when, the where of erythropoiesis. As we looked at in a previous chapter, this process is controlled or regulated by erythropoietin, that hormone that's released from the kidneys in response to hypoxia, which is decreased oxygen delivery to the tissues. That hypoxia is also sensed or moderated or detected by receptors in the aorta and the carotid arteries and in the lungs as well. So hypoxia can result from a decreased number of red blood cells, as might occur in anemia. It might be induced by a decreased amount of hemoglobin, as such as occurs in iron deficiency anemia, or it could be perceived as due to a breathing disorder that compromises how much O2 is available and bound to hemoglobin. So that would be a problem really with the respiratory system that then affects the cardiovascular system. And clinically, those two systems are often interlinked. If there's a problem with one, it's generally compensated for by the other. So if we look at our example here, we see our stimulus, hypoxia. That hypoxia is detected by the kidneys, and the kidneys, and to some extent the liver, release erythropoietin. The erythropoietin goes to the red bone marrow. In an adult, that would be in the proximal epiphyses of the femur that you see here, and the humerus, and in the flat bones, such as the scapula, the sternum, the ilium, and some of the bones of the skull. There, the process of erythropoiesis that we'll look at in just a minute is stimulated, and it takes about 15 days for that process to complete itself. Then we see those red blood cells re-enter, or enter I should say, the cardiovascular system, and the O2 content would go up, and thus we'd see negative feedback on erythropoietin. So here we see the process of erythropoiesis as it would take place in the red bone marrow, and as do all blood cells, it starts with a hematopoietic stem cell called a hemocytoblast or a hematocytoblast. Once you've committed to becoming a red blood cell, then we see the pathway move along from ribosome synthesis, and those ribosomes would be used to make the protein portion of hemoglobin. So really, during this developmental pathway, you're just generating large amounts of hemoglobin. And at the very, very end, almost at the very end, we see the reticulocyte, and that reticulocyte, which is just about a mature red blood cell, is absent of most organelles. It doesn't have a nucleus because it doesn't need them. Its job, and it knows its job, is to transport oxygen on hemoglobin. So without those extra organelles, there's more room for more hemoglobin. And then the reticulocyte, is ejected into general circulation, into plasma, and within a day or two, that erythrocyte is fully mature. To question number 7, and this question relates to erythropoiesis. 7a, what hormone stimulates the process of erythropoiesis? 7b, why is the hormone that you named in 7a released? What's the stimulus? 7c, where does the process of erythropoiesis happen? 7d, how long does the process of erythropoiesis take? 7e, what is the lifespan of a red blood cell? And 7f, what role do the following chemicals play in erythropoiesis? So you should talk about ATP, glucose, phospholipids, proteins, iron, B9, that's vitamin B9, and vitamin B12.